Recovered picked captures from a municipal archive on Hubris show a tall man in a dark coat stepping through cordoned streets, while local enforcers hold back a crowd that has already seen too much. The records are grain-soft and partially degraded, but the movement is clear. He does not hurry, he does not posture. He studies the scene as if every body, every stain on the paving, every broken latch and every frightened witness belongs to the same equation. RBT's reports from later in the same investigation describe a similar pattern. He asked little at first. He watched. He measured contradictions. He let other men speak until they trapped themselves inside their own fear. Surviving testimony from officials, void crew, servants and clerks repeatedly returns to the same impression: cold restraint, precision of a language, an unusual resistance to pressure. By the time his name began circulating through precinct files, cargo manifests, restricted court records and sealed inquisitorial correspondence, the pattern was no longer attached merely to a visiting investigator. It was attached to Gregor Eisenhorn. He was born in the closing years of the 2nd century of the 41st millennium on DeKere's world, a human world that lay well within the immense administrative sprawl of the Imperium. Very little survives in public circulation concerning his family line, and that absence is itself unsurprising. The Inquisition often leaves its own origins indistinct, especially when one of its future agents rises through aptitude rather than noble spectacle. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that Eisenhorn did not emerge from obscurity by accident. He was formed in a culture where loyalty to the Imperium was assumed, where obedience and survival were intertwined, and where information itself was a stratified commodity. Even before he held formal authority, his life was shaped by a wider civilization that rewarded discipline, memory, and the ability to function under conditions that would mentally strip weaker candidates. One of the earliest known markers in his life came when he was still young. At 12 years of age, he witnessed the White Scars take Almenade. The surviving note is brief, but the event matters because it places Eisenhorn in direct contact with the scale of Imperial violence long before he held office. A child who watches an Astartes assault does not merely see soldiers winning ground. He sees a level of force so overwhelming that conventional human categories of courage, fear, rank, and punishment begin to rearrange themselves. Such moments tend to leave either trauma or clarity. In Eisenhorn's case, later conduct suggests clarity hardened first, and sentiment learned to retreat behind it. This helps explain the adult figure later described as austere, guarded, and exceptionally difficult to intimidate. His emotional range did not vanish. It became disciplined, filtered, and subordinated to purpose. By approximately the year 219 of the 41st millennium, Eisenhorn had entered inquisitorial service as an interrogator under Inquisitor Hapshant. This was the crucial stage of his development. An interrogator was not a clerk, nor merely an apprentice in a ceremonial sense. It was an office of practical exposure. The interrogator learned how to detect inconsistencies in witness statements, how to read institutions as well as individuals, and how to distinguish between ordinary corruption and corruption that pointed towards something structurally dangerous. The role also required absolute proximity to the habits of an inquisitor. One observed method, restraint, timing, and the often unpleasant fact that lawful authority in the Imperium was rarely clean. The interrogator did not study evil from a safe distance. He learned to approach it, name it, and sometimes use parts of its logic against itself. During this formative period, Eisenhorn studied alongside Titus Endor, another trainee who would also become notable in later years. The association is important less for friendship than for context. It suggests that Eisenhorn developed inside a competitive and intellectually demanding environment where future inquisitors were measured against one another, not merely for knowledge, but for steadiness, judgment, and survivability. Hapshant's tutelage appears to have been effective. Eisenhorn was elevated to the rank of Inquisitor in the year 222 of the 41st millennium at roughly 24 years of age. That was young by the standards of so grave an office, and it implies unusual confidence from his superiors. The Imperium does not hand rosettes to promising men simply because they are bright. It does so when it believes they can carry legal absolutes into unstable regions and still remain useful at the end of the journey. At this stage in his life, Eisenhorn belonged firmly to the orthodox current of the Inquisition. He was aligned with the Ordo Xenos and, in ideological terms, initially stood among the Puritans, specifically the Amalathian tendency. That distinction matters because it framed the early structure of his thinking. A Puritan Inquisitor could be ruthless, but his ruthlessness was expected to operate within strict boundaries. The enemy was to be destroyed, not studied for empowerment. Alien knowledge was contamination before it was opportunity. Heresy was a breach to be sealed, not a tool to be repurposed. The Amalathian view in particular favoured preservation of imperial stability and the maintenance of order against destabilising extremes. Early Eisenhorn fit that mould well. He was already forceful, already capable of severity, but still believed that the strongest defence of mankind lay in disciplined refusal. His first confirmed successful persecution was directed against the heretic Lamita sire. The surviving references are concise, but their placement in the record shows the case was meaningful in establishing Eisenhorn's credibility. First prosecutions matter in inquisitorial careers because they reveal method. A reckless investigator can stumble into a conviction. A durable one builds a chain that survives scrutiny from peers, hostile institutions, frightened subordinates, and the endlessly adaptive behaviour of the guilty. From the beginning, Eisenhorn appears to have been good at building such chains. He was not merely a hunter of visible offenders, he was a resolver of concealed patterns. Once he fixed on a suspect, he did not treat the matter as complete, until the surrounding structure had been mapped and broken. Soon after, he was temporarily assigned the patrol duties once carried by the late Inquisitor Flammel over the Grand Bank's world's coreward of the Helican subsector. This detail is easy to overlook, but it reveals a great deal about his development. Patrol responsibility in such regions meant long exposure to fragmented jurisdictions, slow communications, incomplete local records, and a broad variety of threats. It required administrative stamina as much as personal daring. It also meant learning how fragile Imperial order could become once distance widened between a world and the centres that claimed to govern it. During this period, Eisenhorn was instrumental in closing a Regia Occulta on Ignix, an occult structure or hidden operation that had facilitated the appearance of orcs on the world and contributed to the deaths of Imperial citizens. The case is instructive because it joins several themes that would define him thereafter: hidden networks, corruption of local systems, sudden intrusion of the non-human into human space, the need for a response that was at once investigative and terminal. These early years did not yet make him legendary, but they made him reliable. Reliability in the Inquisition is not a mild compliment. It means one can be sent into uncertainty and trusted to return with usable truth, however ugly that truth may be. It means one can act without theatrical excess. It means fear does not decide the order of operations. By the end of this phase, Eisenhorn had become exactly the sort of Inquisitor Imperial institutions valued, even if they did not always welcome his arrival. He could navigate legal procedure when procedure helped. He could step over it when necessity demanded. He could work with arbites, military officers, local officials, and mechanicus personnel without being absorbed by their assumptions. He was still building his habits, but the essential pattern was already there. The year 240 of the 41st millennium marked the point at which his career ceased to be merely competent and became historically consequential. In that year he tracked and killed the mass murderer Murdin I clone on Hubris. On the surface, such a case might appear narrower than the occult and Xenos threats that later came to define his reputation. In practice, it became one of the great hinge points of his life. First, it demonstrated his willingness to pursue horror through the ordinary human layers where it often begins, among killers, deviants, social rot, and the institutions that fail to detect them until too late. Second, it brought key figures into his orbit, including Godwin Fishig and Elizabeth Beckwin. Third, and most importantly, it set him on the path toward Pontius Glor and the Necrotuke. the chain of events that would alter not only his career but also his philosophical foundation. The hubris investigation deserves attention because it shows Eisenhorn in transition, even before he himself would have recognized it. A mass murderer is not an abstract enemy. Such a pursuit forces proximity to damage done at human scale. It also demands a form of patience distinct from battlefield aggression. One must sift through lies, urban fear, rumour, procedural incompetence, and the private appetites of the guilty. It was precisely the sort of work at which Eisenhorn excelled. He approached murder not as spectacle, but as residue. Every act left traces in movement, language, timing, procurement, human weakness, and institutional blind spots. The killer mattered. The structure that allowed the killer to operate mattered equally. That same method later proved devastatingly effective when the crimes before him became conspiratorial, rather than merely criminal. By this point, Eisenhorn was no longer just a rosette bearer executing inherited doctrine. He was developing a recognizably personal style. He travelled with purpose but without ornament. He did not cultivate unnecessary grandeur, though he could wield the majesty of his office when it served the investigation. His authority rested less on display than on mental force. Accounts connected to his mature years emphasize a powerful will and considerable psychic talent, particularly telepathic compulsion through speech. Those traits did not emerge from nowhere in later life. They were already being trained in these earlier decades, even if not yet fully notorious. The important point is that his intellect, his self-command, and his psychic faculty reinforced one another. He did not simply know what to ask, he knew how to make answers buckle. It is also in these earlier years that one can most clearly observe the tragic irony of Eisenhorn's life. The young Inquisitor who built his reputation through discipline and controlled orthodoxy would eventually become known for operating near the edge of Imperial doctrine, investigating conspiracies that placed him against aliens, heretics, demons, and even fellow Inquisitors. That later transformation did not begin with sudden corruption. It began with competence. It began with a man so determined to defeat the enemy correctly that he was repeatedly forced to study the enemy at closer range than orthodoxy considered safe. His early victories taught him that evil was networked, patient, layered, and adaptive. Every successful purge exposed another chamber behind the wall. Every solved case widened the map instead of closing it. In that sense, the seeds of his later reputation were already present in his most lawful years. Still, the man before the fall into ambiguity, before the demon host became attached to his name, before rival inquisitors spoke of him with equal parts respect and suspicion. In the beginning, Gregor Eisenhorn was a gifted servant of the Imperium, shaped by close observation, trained by inquisitorial rigor, and sharpened by real investigations in real places where citizens died if errors were made. He came from DeKere's world into a career of unusual speed, passed through the discipline of Hapshant's tutelage, earned his seal young, pursued heretics effectively, handled frontier patrol responsibilities, dismantled concealed threats, and arrived at hubris already carrying the habits that would define his future. He was precise without being ornamental, severe without being chaotic, and intelligent enough to understand that the Imperium's enemies were rarely isolated phenomena. They nested inside history, class, doctrine, commerce, grief, ambition, and belief. The man who stepped into the hubris murders was already more than an investigator. He was the product of a long preparation that had taught him how to look at the galaxy and assume that the visible crime was only the surface. That man was Gregor Eisenhorn. By the time Gregor Eisenhorn had established himself as a functioning inquisitor within the Ordo Xenos, his physical presence and operational profile had already become consistent enough to be recognized across multiple sectors. He was a tall man by baseline human standards, carrying himself with a controlled, upright posture that suggested both discipline and a constant readiness to act. His frame was neither excessively bulky nor slight, instead reflecting a balance between endurance and functional strength. His facial features were sharp and deliberate in structure. with a gaze that was frequently described as focused to the point of discomfort for those under examination. His eyes, often noted as pale or grey, carried a steadiness that made prolonged eye contact difficult for those unaccustomed to scrutiny. There were no unnecessary embellishments in his appearance. His clothing and armour choices reflected utility, authority and movement efficiency rather than ceremonial excess. His standard attire typically consisted of a long, dark coat reinforced with hidden armour plating, designed to provide protection without sacrificing mobility. Beneath this, he often wore layered garments suited for both void travel and planetary deployment, allowing him to transition between environments without delay. Unlike more ostentatious Imperial figures, Eisenhorn avoided unnecessary ornamentation. Every component of his equipment served a purpose. Even the visible symbols of his authority, such as the Inquisitorial rosette, were deployed strategically rather than displayed continuously. He understood that authority was most effective when revealed at the correct moment, not announced prematurely. Among his most defining traits was his psychic capability. Eisenhorn was a sanctioned psyker of considerable strength, and his abilities were not merely supplementary to his investigations, but integral to them. His most commonly observed technique was a form of telepathic influence delivered through speech, often referred to as compulsion. This was not a crude domination of the mind, but a precise insertion of directive thought, layered into conversation in such a way that resistance became increasingly difficult without the subject fully understanding why. This method allowed him to extract information, disrupt hostile intent, or enforce compliance without immediate resort to violence. It also made him particularly dangerous in interrogation settings, where psychological pressure and psychic influence could be combined into a single, controlled process. In addition to compulsion, Eisenhorn demonstrated broader telepathic awareness, allowing him to sense emotional states, detect deception, and identify anomalies in behaviour that might otherwise pass unnoticed. His psychic discipline was carefully maintained, especially in his earlier career, where adherence to sanctioned methods remained strict. Unlike unstable psychers who relied on raw power, Eisenhorn's approach emphasized control, efficiency, and minimal exposure to unnecessary warp influence. This restraint was not only a matter of doctrine, but also of personal philosophy at that stage in his life. His primary weapon was typically a bolt pistol, a standard but highly lethal firearm favoured by many within the Inquisition. The bolt pistol fired self-propelled mass-reactive rounds capable of penetrating armour and detonating within the target, making it effective against both human and non-human threats. Eisenhorn's use of the weapon reflected his broader operational style. He did not fire recklessly. When he chose to engage, it was with intent to end the threat decisively. The weapon was an extension of his authority, not a substitute for it. Alongside his ranged capability, Eisenhorn was also known to carry a force sword, a weapon that interfaced directly with his psychic abilities. A force sword was not merely a blade. When activated through psychic channeling, it could disrupt the very essence of a target, making it particularly effective against warp entities and other unnatural threats. The presence of such a weapon indicated both his status and his readiness to engage in close combat when necessary. While he did not seek melee confrontation as a primary tactic, he was fully capable of operating within it when conditions required. His equipment often included a range of investigative tools suited to his role: data slates for information analysis, encrypted communication devices for coordination across secure channels, and scanning instruments for detecting anomalies in biological, mechanical, or warp-related signatures were all part of his operational kit. These tools were not carried in excess, but selected based on mission requirements. Eisenhorn favoured adaptability over redundancy. He relied on preparation, but also on his ability to improvise when faced with incomplete data or rapidly shifting conditions. Transport and mobility were also critical components of his operational capability. Eisenhorn commanded access to void-capable vessels, most notably the gun cutter, a versatile craft designed for both atmospheric and space travel. The gun cutter allowed him to deploy rapidly, extract personnel, and maintain a degree of independence from larger Imperial fleets. This autonomy was essential for an Inquisitor, whose work often required discretion and the ability to act without drawing attention from wider military structures. The vessel was not merely transportation, it functioned as a mobile base of operations, equipped for analysis, containment, and limited combat engagement. Beyond his personal equipment, Eisenhorn's effectiveness was amplified by his use of retinues. While not a physical tool in the traditional sense, his selection and management of personnel were as critical as any weapon he carried. Individuals such as Godwin Fishig, a former Arbites officer, and Elizabeth Biquin, whose unique qualities made her invaluable in certain operations, were not chosen randomly. Eisenhorn selected individuals who filled specific operational gaps, whether in combat, investigation, or specialized resistance to warp phenomena. He did not treat his retinue as expendable assets, though he was fully aware of the risks inherent in their roles. Their presence allowed him to extend his reach, gather information more effectively, and respond to threats across multiple fronts simultaneously. At the core of all these traits, weapons and tools, was Eisenhorn's personality, which defined how and when each element was used. He was disciplined to a degree that bordered on rigid, especially in his early career. Decisions were made based on logic, evidence, and the requirements of Imperial law as he understood it. Emotional considerations were present, but tightly controlled. He did not allow personal attachment to override operational necessity, though this restraint would be tested repeatedly in later years. Eisenhorn's mindset was analytical and methodical. He approached problems as systems to be understood rather than obstacles to be overcome through force alone. This made him particularly effective against complex threats, where direct confrontation would fail or produce incomplete results. He was patient when patience was required, willing to observe and gather information over extended periods before acting. At the same time, he could transition rapidly into decisive action once the necessary conditions were met. This balance between patience and precision was one of his most defining characteristics. He also possessed a strong sense of responsibility toward the Imperium and its citizens, though this sense was expressed through protection rather than compassion in the conventional sense. He did not seek to comfort. He sought to eliminate threats so that others could live without knowing how close they had come to destruction. This created a distance between himself and those he protected. He was not a figure of reassurance, he was a figure of necessity. Another critical aspect of his personality was his capacity for adaptation. While he began as a strict adherent to Puritan doctrine, his experiences gradually forced him to confront situations where established methods proved insufficient. Even in his earlier years, there are indications of a willingness to question, to adjust, and to consider alternatives when faced with persistent or evolving threats. This adaptability was not yet fully visible as divergence, but it existed as potential. It was the trait that would later allow him to survive in circumstances that destroyed less flexible Inquisitors. Despite his authority and capability, Eisenhorn was not immune to isolation. The nature of his work required secrecy, compartmentalization of information, and a constant awareness that even allies could become compromised. This produced a controlled distance in his interactions. Trust was given carefully and withdrawn when necessary. His retinue provided a degree of connection, but even within those relationships there remained an underlying awareness of duty that could not be set aside. In total, Gregor Eisenhorn's distinctive traits, weapons, and personality formed a cohesive operational identity. His physical presence projected authority without excess. His psychic abilities allowed him to manipulate and understand minds with precision. His weapons provided decisive force when required. His tools enabled investigation across multiple domains. His mobility ensured independence. His retinue extended his capabilities beyond the limits of a single individual. And his personality governed all of these elements with discipline, logic, and a growing capacity for adaptation. At this stage in his life, these components existed in alignment with Imperial doctrine. They made him effective, respected, and dangerous to those who opposed the Imperium. What they also did, though not yet fully realised, was prepare him for the moment when doctrine alone would no longer be enough. As Gregor Eisenhorn's authority matured, the scale and complexity of his assignments increased accordingly, and the record begins to show a consistent pattern of investigations that extended beyond isolated incidents into layered conspiracies. His early successes had already demonstrated reliability, but it was in the progression of these later operations that his reputation became firmly established across multiple Imperial institutions. He was no longer viewed merely as a capable investigator. He was recognized as an Inquisitor who could enter unstable environments, identify concealed threats, and dismantle them even when those threats were embedded within otherwise functional systems. One of the defining sequences of his career began with the pursuit of Pontius Glor, a figure whose existence challenged conventional assumptions about death, identity, and continuity within the Imperium. Glor was not simply a heretic operating in secrecy. He represented a form of persistence that extended beyond a single physical body, maintaining influence through preserved biological matter and transferred consciousness. Eisenhorn's engagement with this case required a departure from straightforward investigative models. The target could not be neutralized through conventional elimination alone. It required identification of hidden repositories, understanding of technological and biological processes outside standard Imperial frameworks, and coordination across multiple locations where fragments of Glor's existence had been stored or concealed. The investigation into Glor also led Eisenhorn to confront the existence of the Necrotuque, a text associated with warp-based knowledge and forbidden practices. The presence of such an artifact significantly altered the operational context of the investigation. The case was no longer confined to heretical crime. It became a convergence point between technological corruption, psychic influence, and doctrinal violation. Eisenhorn's handling of the situation demonstrated both his capability and the beginning of a shift in his approach. He did not immediately reject all contact with the forbidden. Instead, he assessed its structure, its potential, and its threat profile. This did not yet constitute full ideological deviation, but it marked the point at which strict avoidance began to give way to controlled engagement. During this period, Eisenhorn's effectiveness was reinforced by his continued use of a carefully selected retinue. Godwin Fischig served as a stabilizing presence, bringing the procedural rigor of the Adeptus Arbites into operations that might otherwise become unstable. Elizabeth Bequin, whose nature rendered her resistant to psychic detection, provided a unique advantage in environments where warp influence or psychic surveillance would compromise ordinary agents. These individuals were not auxiliary. They were integrated components of Eisenhorn's method. Their presence allowed him to approach threats from multiple angles simultaneously, combining legal authority, investigative discipline, and specialized resistance into a single operational framework. Another significant element of his career was his involvement in the Ceruthi operations, which exposed him to Xenos structures that did not conform to standard Imperial classifications. The Ceruthi were not merely another hostile species. Their architecture, perception, and interaction with reality itself operated according to principles that destabilized human cognition. Engagement with such entities required more than physical resilience. It demanded the ability to process and act within environments where perception could not be fully trusted. Eisenhorn's survival and success in these encounters further reinforced his standing, but they also contributed to the gradual expansion of his operational boundaries. Exposure to non-human logic systems forced him to reconsider the limits of Imperial understanding and the tools required to confront threats that did not adhere to human frameworks. As his investigations continued, Eisenhorn increasingly found himself operating in opposition, not only to external enemies, but also to elements within the Inquisition itself. This was not the result of personal conflict alone. It reflected deeper ideological divisions between Puritan and radical approaches. Inquisitors such as Quixos represented a willingness to engage with forbidden knowledge to achieve strategic advantage, while others remained committed to strict doctrinal purity. Eisenhorn's position during this period became progressively complex. He did not align fully with radical philosophy, Yet his actions began to reflect a willingness to use methods that Puritan doctrine would consider unacceptable. This tension became particularly evident in his eventual use of a demon host. The binding of a warp entity into a controlled vessel was one of the most controversial practices within the Inquisition, often associated with radical factions willing to risk corruption for power. Eisenhorn's decision to employ such a tool was not made casually. It emerged from cumulative exposure to threats that conventional methods had failed to neutralize. From his perspective, the Imperium faced enemies that operated without restraint, and victory required tools capable of matching that level of threat. However, this decision marked a clear divergence from his earlier alignment. It demonstrated that his adaptability, once a strength within doctrinal boundaries, had now extended beyond them. Despite these developments, Eisenhorn's core objective remained consistent. He sought the protection of the Imperium and the elimination of threats that endangered its stability. His methods changed, but his purpose did not. This distinction is critical in understanding his trajectory. He did not abandon his role. He redefined the means by which he fulfilled it. This placed him in a position where he was both effective and controversial, respected for his results, but viewed with increasing suspicion by those who adhered strictly to established doctrine. Throughout these operations, Eisenhorn maintained a high level of operational independence. His access to resources, including voidcraft, personnel, and restricted information networks, allowed him to function without reliance on local authorities or military structures. This independence was essential for investigations that crossed jurisdictional boundaries and required discretion. It also contributed to his isolation. As his methods diverged and his knowledge expanded into areas considered dangerous, the number of individuals capable of understanding or supporting his work decreased. He operated increasingly at the edge of Imperial systems, where authority existed but consensus did not. In terms of measurable achievements, Eisenhorn successfully dismantled multiple heretical networks, neutralized high-value targets, and prevented the spread of warp-based corruption across several regions. His actions disrupted operations that, if left unchecked, would have resulted in significant loss of life and potential destabilization of Imperial control. These outcomes reinforced his reputation as an effective Inquisitor, even as the methods used to achieve them became subjects of debate. His organizational alignment, therefore, cannot be described as static. He began firmly within the Puritan tradition of the Ordo Xenos, operating under the assumption that strict adherence to doctrine was the most reliable path to victory. Over time, his experiences forced him to confront the limitations of that approach. He did not immediately adopt radical ideology, but he incorporated elements of it into his methodology. This placed him in a transitional position where he retained aspects of both perspectives without fully belonging to either. Such a position was inherently unstable within the hierarchical and often rigid structure of the Inquisition. By the later stages of his career, Eisenhorn had become a figure defined as much by his contradictions as by his achievements. He was a defender of the Imperium, who employed methods considered dangerous by his peers. He was a disciplined investigator who engaged with forces that could not be fully controlled. He was a loyal servant who operated increasingly outside the comfort of established doctrine. These contradictions did not negate his effectiveness. They defined the conditions under which that effectiveness was maintained. In conclusion, Gregor Eisenhorn's career represents a progression from structured orthodoxy to adaptive pragmatism. His notable achievements established him as a capable and reliable Inquisitor, capable of addressing complex and multi-layered threats. His organizational alignment evolved in response to those threats, moving from strict Puritan adherence toward a more flexible and at times controversial approach. Throughout this progression, his core objective remained unchanged, even as the means by which he pursued it became increasingly complex. The figure that emerges as not a simple agent of Imperial authority, but a developed and multifaceted individual shaped by experience, necessity, and exposure to forces that challenge the boundaries of doctrine. He stands as an example of what occurs when a system designed for control encounters realities that resist containment. His story does not conclude with resolution. It continues into deeper conflict, where the distinction between tool and corruption, authority and deviation, becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. Records extracted from the Adeptus Administratum and cross-referenced with fragmented Mechanicus data logs present a profile of Gregor Eisenhorn that is consistent in outcome but varied in interpretation. Within Administratum registries, his presence is most often associated with disruption followed by restoration. Worlds that appear stable on the surface frequently register minor irregularities in tithe compliance, census accuracy, or trade consistency prior to his arrival. These irregularities, when mapped over time, reveal patterns of concealed interference. In nearly all documented cases where Eisenhorn intervened, these patterns were not merely corrected but exposed as part of larger, previously undetected networks. The immediate consequence was administrative shock. Systems believed to be functioning within acceptable parameters were revealed to have been compromised at structural levels. Administratum observers describe his operational footprint as precise but invasive. He did not rely on existing reports as final authority. Instead, he treated them as initial layers requiring verification. This often resulted in the temporary destabilization of bureaucratic confidence. Officials accustomed to predictable cycles of reporting found their data reinterpreted, cross-examined, and in many cases invalidated. However, post-operation assessments indicate that the system subjected to his scrutiny emerged with higher long-term stability. Tithe flows became more consistent, population records more accurate, and compliance enforcement more effective. From a purely administrative perspective, his interventions produced measurable improvements, though the process by which those improvements were achieved was frequently described as disruptive. Mechanicus observations differ in tone but align in substance. Data extracted from Forge World archives and exploratory logs indicate that Eisenhorn demonstrated an unusual capacity to engage with technological and xenological anomalies without immediate rejection or uncontrolled curiosity. He approached unfamiliar systems with structured analysis, prioritizing function, origin, and potential threat vectors. This methodology allowed him to operate effectively in environments where standard Imperial doctrine would mandate immediate destruction without examination. Mechanicus personnel noted that while he did not possess the deep, technical specialization of a magos, he exhibited sufficient comprehension to identify critical components, assess operational integrity, and determine whether an artifact or system required containment, destruction, or controlled study. One recurring observation from Mechanicus sources is his restraint in the presence of non-standard technology. Where less disciplined agents might either destroy or attempt to exploit such systems prematurely, Eisenhorn maintained a controlled distance until sufficient understanding had been achieved. This restraint reduced the likelihood of unintended activation or escalation, particularly in cases involving Xenos constructs or warp-influenced devices. It also facilitated collaboration with Mechanicus operatives, who could then apply specialized knowledge under conditions that remained stable enough for analysis. Notable findings across combined Administratum and Mechanicus records consistently highlight Eisenhorn's ability to identify connections between otherwise unrelated anomalies. In several documented instances, minor discrepancies in trade manifests, localized behavioral deviations among populations, and isolated technological irregularities were traced back to a single underlying cause. This capacity for pattern recognition extended beyond standard investigative procedure. It suggests a cognitive approach that prioritized system-level analysis over isolated problem-solving. Rather than addressing symptoms individually, Eisenhorn sought the originating structure from which those symptoms emerged. Administratum analysts have noted that this approach often resulted in the exposure of corruption at levels higher than initially anticipated. Local officials, planetary governors, and even regional authorities were found to be either complicit or compromised. The removal of such figures created short-term instability, but ultimately reinforced Imperial control. From a bureaucratic standpoint, this pattern presents a paradox. Eisenhorn's actions temporarily disrupt established order, but the resulting systems demonstrate increased resilience and compliance. This has led to a classification of his interventions as high-risk, high-stability outcomes within certain internal assessments. Mechanicus data further expands on his interactions with environments affected by non-human influence. In operations involving Xenos architecture or warp-altered constructs, Eisenhorn demonstrated an ability to maintain operational coherence despite sensory and cognitive distortions. This capability is of particular interest to Mechanicus observers, as such environments often degrade human perception to the point of functional impairment. His combination of psychic discipline and analytical focus allowed him to navigate these conditions without significant loss of effectiveness. As a result, he was able to gather actionable data from environments that would otherwise be considered inaccessible. Another notable observation concerns his management of operational resources. Eisenhorn consistently utilized a limited but highly effective set of personnel and equipment, rather than relying on large-scale deployments. Administratum records indicate that this approach reduced logistical strain and minimized visibility, allowing investigations to proceed without attracting premature attention. Mechanicus sources interpret this as an optimization of resource allocation, where efficiency is prioritized over volume. This method also aligns with his broader tendency toward precision. He did not overwhelm a problem with force unless necessary. He reduced it to a state where targeted action could produce definitive results. Despite these positive assessments, both Administratum and Mechanicus records contain indications of emerging irregularities in his operational profile. Administratum observers note a gradual increase in deviations from standard procedural frameworks. While earlier operations adhered closely to established protocols, later interventions show a willingness to bypass or reinterpret those protocols when deemed insufficient. This shift is not presented as disorder, but as adaptation. However, it introduces variables that are difficult to quantify within bureaucratic models designed for predictability. Mechanicus observations parallel this assessment with a focus on his engagement with restricted knowledge. Data logs indicate instances where Eisenhorn interacted with artifacts, texts, or systems classified beyond standard clearance levels. In each case, the interaction was controlled and purpose-driven, but the cumulative effect suggests a trajectory toward increased tolerance for exposure to potentially corrupting influences. Mechanicus analysts do not uniformly interpret this as negative. Some records classify it as necessary adaptation in response to evolving threat environments. Others flag it as a deviation from optimal containment practices. It is within these combined observations that a more complex profile emerges. Eisenhorn is not merely an effective Inquisitor operating within established parameters. He is an adaptive agent whose methods evolve in response to the limitations of those parameters. From the Administratum perspective, this results in improved systemic stability at the cost of procedural consistency. From the Mechanicus perspective, it produces effective engagement with complex and non-standard threats, while introducing controlled exposure to elements typically avoided. In terms of measurable impact, his operations consistently result in the removal of high-value threats, the restoration of administrative accuracy, and the containment or destruction of anomalous systems. These outcomes align with primary Imperial objectives. However, the processes by which they are achieved become increasingly difficult to categorize within existing frameworks. This has led to a degree of internal divergence in how his actions are evaluated. Some records emphasize results as the primary metric, classifying his methods as acceptable variations within operational tolerance. Others emphasize adherence to doctrine, identifying his deviations as points of concern. Across all sources, one conclusion remains consistent. Gregor Eisenhorn operates with a level of precision, adaptability, and effectiveness that places him among the more capable agents within the Inquisition. His ability to integrate investigative, administrative, and technical considerations into a unified approach allows him to address threats that extend beyond the capacity of more narrowly focused operatives. At the same time, this integration produces outcomes that challenge the boundaries of established doctrine, creating a profile that is both valuable and difficult to fully reconcile within rigid institutional structures. These impressions, observations, and findings do not present a finalized judgment. They represent an ongoing assessment of an individual whose methods continue to evolve in parallel with the threats he confronts. Compiled administratum transcripts and Mechanicus data fragments indicate that Gregor Eisenhorn's personal engagements were rarely isolated incidents. They were instead points of intersection, where multiple layers of Imperial function converged under pressure. Each engagement, whether involving heretical cells, Xenos anomalies, or internal corruption, carried implications that extended beyond the immediate objective. Administratum observers note that his presence often coincided with moments where localized instability risked escalation into broader systemic disruption. His role, therefore, was not limited to resolution of individual threats. It involved containment of cascading failure across administrative, political, and military structures. In documented engagements involving noble houses and planetary governance, Eisenhorn demonstrated a consistent approach that prioritized structural integrity over individual status. Administratum records from several worlds describe interventions where ruling figures were investigated, detained, or removed following confirmation of compromise. These actions were not taken lightly, as the removal of a planetary governor or high-ranking official introduced immediate risks to civil order. However, Eisenhorn's methodology ensured that such removals were accompanied by rapid stabilization measures. Replacement authorities were identified or installed, tithe continuity was preserved, and local enforcement bodies were either reinforced or restructured to prevent secondary collapse. From an administrative standpoint, these engagements highlight his capacity to operate within politically sensitive environments without allowing political considerations to override operational necessity. Mechanicus' perspectives on these engagements emphasize his ability to maintain functional cooperation with technical authorities during periods of disruption. In operations where forge assets, manufacturum outputs, or technological infrastructures were at risk, Eisenhorn coordinated effectively with Mechanicus personnel to ensure continuity of critical systems. Data logs indicate that he understood the strategic importance of maintaining production capabilities, particularly in regions supplying military or logistical support to wider Imperial campaigns. His interventions were therefore calibrated not only to eliminate threats, but to preserve the operational capacity of affected worlds. This dual focus on eradication and preservation is repeatedly identified as a distinguishing feature of his engagements. Personal engagements involving military elements further reinforce his strategic value. Eisenhorn frequently operated alongside Imperial Guard units, naval detachments, and, in rare cases, Astartes forces. Administratum war records suggest that his presence within a theatre of operations often preceded or coincided with the identification of non-conventional threats. These included infiltration by heretical agents, deployment of warp-based weaponry, or the presence of Xenos influence within command structures. His role in such environments was not to replace military command, but to augment it by addressing variables outside standard tactical doctrine. This allowed military forces to operate with reduced internal risk, as hidden factors that could compromise engagements were identified and neutralized. Mechanicus' analyses of these interactions highlight his effectiveness in translating non-technical observations into actionable data for technical specialists. When confronted with anomalous phenomena, Eisenhorn did not attempt to fully resolve technical complexities independently. Instead, he identified key parameters and communicated them in a manner that allowed Mechanicus personnel to apply specialized solutions. This division of function maintained efficiency and minimized operational delay. It also reinforced a pattern of cooperation in which Eisenhorn acted as a bridge between investigative authority and technical execution. The political importance of Eisenhorn's engagements becomes particularly evident when examining cases involving interdepartmental conflict or jurisdictional overlap. The Imperium's vast structure often produces friction between its own institutions, with competing priorities and interpretations of doctrine leading to operational delays or conflicts. Eisenhorn's authority as an Inquisitor allowed him to override such conflicts when necessary. Administratum records indicate that he exercised this authority selectively, intervening primarily when delays posed a direct threat to stability or security. His decisions in these contexts were typically final, reducing prolonged disputes and allowing operations to proceed without further obstruction. However, this authority also introduced tension. Instances are recorded where local or regional authorities resisted his intervention, either due to political self-interest or differing interpretations of jurisdiction. In such cases, Eisenhorn's response was consistent. He asserted inquisitorial authority decisively, prioritizing outcome over consensus. While this approach ensured operational continuity, it also contributed to a perception of him as a disruptive force within established hierarchies. From an administratum perspective, this is both a strength and a liability. It enables rapid resolution of critical issues but complicates long-term relationships between institutions. Mechanicus records approach this dynamic from a different angle. They classify Eisenhorn's authority as a stabilizing override mechanism within complex systems. When standard processes fail to produce timely results, the introduction of an Inquisitor with the capacity to bypass procedural constraints restores operational flow. This interpretation frames his actions not as disruption, but as correction. However, it also acknowledges that repeated reliance on such overrides indicates underlying inefficiencies within the system itself. The subject value of Gregor Eisenhorn, as assessed by combined administratum and mechanicus sources, is therefore multifaceted. At the most basic level, he is a high-efficiency agent capable of resolving complex threats with minimal resource expenditure relative to outcome. His operations consistently achieve primary objectives while preserving critical infrastructure and administrative function. This efficiency translates into measurable benefits, including sustained tithe compliance, reduced population loss, and maintained production output. At a higher level, his value lies in his adaptability. Eisenhorn operates effectively across a wide range of environments, from densely populated hive cities to remote frontier worlds and void-based installations. His ability to adjust methodology based on context allows him to address threats that would overwhelm more specialized operatives. This versatility reduces the need for multiple agents or departments to be deployed simultaneously, streamlining response efforts and conserving resources. Mechanicus evaluations add an additional dimension to his value by emphasizing his interaction with anomalous systems. Eisenhorn's capacity to engage with non-standard technology and warp-influence phenomena without immediate degradation of operational integrity is identified as a rare and significant trait. This capability allows for the extraction of information and the development of countermeasures that would otherwise be inaccessible. While such engagement carries inherent risk, the potential gains in understanding and preparedness are considered substantial. Despite these advantages, both administratum and mechanicus assessments include cautionary elements. Administratum records note that his increasing deviation from standard procedural frameworks introduces unpredictability into long-term planning models. While individual operations remain effective, the cumulative impact of these deviations is difficult to quantify. This creates challenges in integrating his actions into broader strategic projections, where consistency is a key factor. Mechanicus records express similar concerns in relation to his exposure to restricted knowledge and practices. While his controlled approach mitigates immediate risk, the long-term effects of repeated exposure remain uncertain. Some analyses suggest that continued engagement with such elements may alter operational parameters in ways that are not immediately observable. Others argue that such adaptation is necessary to maintain effectiveness against evolving threats. This divergence reflects a broader uncertainty in how best to evaluate agents operating at the limits of established doctrine. In examining Eisenhorn's personal engagements, political and military importance, and overall subject value, a consistent pattern emerges. He is an agent whose effectiveness derives from the integration of multiple competencies, including investigation, authority, adaptability, and controlled risk engagement. His actions produce outcomes that align with Imperial objectives, but they do so through methods that challenge traditional frameworks. From the perspective of the Adeptus Administratum, he is a corrective force capable of restoring stability in compromised systems, albeit through disruptive means. From the perspective of the Adeptus Mechanicus, he is an adaptive operator capable of engaging with complex and anomalous phenomena while maintaining functional integrity. In both cases, his value is recognized, but not without reservation. These assessments do not conclude with a definitive classification. Instead, they reflect an ongoing evaluation of an individual whose role continues to evolve in response to the demands placed upon him. Aggregated Administratum war ledgers and Mechanicus conflict logs indicate that Gregor Eisenhorn's involvement in warfare was rarely defined by conventional frontline command. His presence is instead recorded at points where standard military doctrine proved insufficient to explain, predict, or contain the conditions of engagement. In these instances, battles are not described solely in terms of troop movements or territorial gains. They are framed as layered conflicts in which unseen variables influenced outcomes as heavily as visible force. Administratum summaries of campaigns associated with Eisenhorn frequently begin with irregularities. These include breakdowns in command cohesion, unexplained losses of material, deviations in unit behavior, or sudden failures in communication systems. Such anomalies often preceded full engagement, suggesting that the battles themselves were secondary manifestations of deeper disruptions. Eisenhorn's role in these scenarios was to identify and neutralize the underlying cause, thereby restoring the battlefield to a state where conventional forces could operate effectively. One of the most consistently referenced operational patterns involves infiltration by heretical agents within Imperial ranks. Administratum records describe cases in which entire command structures were compromised, either through ideological corruption or direct manipulation. In such environments, military effectiveness degraded rapidly, as orders became unreliable and coordination collapsed. Eisenhorn's interventions in these cases focused on isolating compromised elements and re-establishing a functional chain of command. Once these corrections were implemented, subsequent engagements showed marked improvements in cohesion and outcome. Mechanicus battle analyses expand on this pattern by examining the technological dimensions of such conflicts. Data logs reveal instances where equipment malfunction, data corruption, or anomalous energy signatures played a decisive role in battle conditions. These anomalies were not random failures, but often the result of deliberate interference, either through warp influence or the application of non-standard technologies. Eisenhorn's ability to identify these disruptions allowed Mechanicus personnel to implement targeted countermeasures, restoring system integrity and enabling continued operation of critical war assets. Engagements involving Xenos threats present a distinct category within the records. Administratum accounts of these battles emphasize unpredictability, as enemy behavior frequently deviated from established tactical models. Eisenhorn's involvement in such engagements often coincided with the identification of previously unclassified patterns or capabilities. His investigative approach allowed for rapid adaptation, enabling Imperial forces to adjust tactics in response to emerging threats. In several documented cases, this resulted in the containment or elimination of Xenos elements that would have otherwise inflicted sustained losses. Mechanicus' perspectives on these engagements focus on Eisenhorn's interaction with non-human technologies and environments. In battles where Xenos constructs or warp-altered structures were present, standard equipment often proved insufficient or unreliable. Eisenhorn's capacity to operate within these conditions, combined with his ability to relay critical observations, enabled the development of effective responses. Mechanicus logs indicate that data recovered from such engagements contributed to broader understanding of Xenos systems, informing future countermeasures and technological adaptations. Another significant category of conflict involves engagements with warp-based entities or phenomena. Administratum records classify these events as high risk, with potential for widespread contamination and loss of control. In such scenarios, conventional military force alone is often ineffective, as the enemy operates outside physical constraints. Eisenhorn's role in these engagements was central, as his psychic abilities and investigative methods allowed for direct interaction with warp-influenced elements. His interventions frequently resulted in containment or banishment of such entities, preventing escalation into full-scale incursions. Mechanicus analyses of these encounters highlight the importance of controlled engagement. Data logs indicate that Eisenhorn approached warp-based threats with a combination of caution and precision, avoiding unnecessary exposure while applying targeted actions to achieve containment. This approach minimized collateral damage and preserved operational integrity, even in environments where standard protocols would mandate complete withdrawal or destruction. The ability to maintain functionality under such conditions is identified as a key factor in the success of these engagements. Across all categories of conflict, Eisenhorn's involvement is associated with a consistent set of results. Administratum records indicate that battles in which he played a significant role show higher rates of objective completion, lower levels of prolonged instability, and more effective restoration of administrative function following engagement. Tithe compliance, population stability, and infrastructure integrity are all observed to recover more rapidly in regions where his interventions occurred. However, these results are not without associated costs. Administratum assessments note that the processes leading to these outcomes often involve significant disruption. Command structures are altered, personnel are removed or reassigned, and local governance is restructured. While these actions contribute to long-term stability, they create short-term volatility that must be managed carefully. In some cases, the removal of compromised elements leads to temporary gaps in authority, requiring rapid deployment of replacement personnel to prevent further destabilization. Mechanicus records identify additional costs related to exposure and resource allocation. Engagements involving anomalous technology or warp phenomena often result in the loss or contamination of equipment, requiring extensive decontamination or replacement processes. While Eisenhorn's methods minimize unnecessary loss, the nature of the threats encountered ensures that some level of material degradation is unavoidable. These factors are incorporated into broader logistical models, which account for the increased demands associated with such operations. An area of particular interest within Mechanicus analyses is the cumulative data yield from Eisenhorn's engagements. Each operation generates information regarding enemy behavior, technological anomalies, and environmental conditions that would otherwise remain undocumented. This data is processed and integrated into Mechanicus knowledge systems, contributing to the development of improved detection methods, defensive technologies, and tactical frameworks. From this perspective, Eisenhorn's engagements are not only operationally effective but also informationally valuable. Despite these advantages, both Administratum and Mechanicus sources acknowledge a degree of unpredictability in his methods. As his career progresses, deviations from standard doctrine become more pronounced. Administratum records note instances where established procedures are bypassed in favor of direct action, resulting in faster resolution but reduced procedural transparency. Mechanicus logs similarly identify cases where engagement with restricted or hazardous elements exceeds typical safety parameters, even when such engagement produces successful outcomes. This unpredictability introduces challenges in integrating his actions into long-term strategic planning. Administrator models, which rely on consistent patterns and predictable processes, struggle to accommodate an agent whose methods evolve in response to situational demands. Mechanicus systems, while more adaptable, still require defined parameters to ensure controlled experimentation and analysis. Eisenhorn's approach, which prioritizes outcome over conformity, operates at the edge of these parameters. In conclusion, the war and battle records associated with Gregor Eisenhorn present a profile of an Inquisitor whose contributions extend beyond conventional definitions of military engagement. His involvement transforms battles from isolated conflicts into components of broader investigative processes, where the identification and neutralization of underlying threats are as critical as the engagement itself. The results of his actions consistently align with Imperial objectives, producing increased stability, improved operational efficiency, and valuable data for future application. From the perspective of the Adeptus Administratum, he is an agent who restores order through decisive intervention, even when such intervention disrupts established systems. From the perspective of the Adeptus Mechanicus, he is a source of both operational effectiveness and critical data, capable of engaging with complex and hazardous phenomena while maintaining functional integrity. These assessments converge on a single conclusion. Gregor Eisenhorn is not defined solely by the battles he participates in, but by the way those battles are understood, managed and resolved under his influence. His presence alters the structure of conflict itself, converting uncertainty into actionable information and instability into controlled outcomes. At the same time, the methods by which these results are achieved continue to challenge the frameworks designed to contain and evaluate them, ensuring that his profile remains under constant review. Inquisition archive fragments concerning Gregor Eisenhorn present a profile that is markedly less uniform than those preserved within Administratum or Mechanicus records. Where other institutions emphasize measurable outcomes, Inquisition documents focus on trajectory. The central concern is not solely what Eisenhorn has achieved, but how his methods have evolved over time and what those changes imply for long-term doctrinal stability. Early entries classify him as a disciplined and reliable agent, operating within acceptable Puritan boundaries. Later entries introduce qualifiers. These include references to methodological deviation, controlled engagement with restricted elements, and a growing independence from collective oversight. Initial impressions recorded by fellow Inquisitors describe Eisenhorn as methodical, restrained, and resistant to impulsive action. He was noted for his ability to maintain composure in high-pressure environments, and for his preference toward evidence-based conclusions. These traits aligned closely with Puritan expectations, particularly within the Amalathian tendency, which prioritized preservation of imperial order and stability. At this stage, there are no recorded concerns regarding ideological deviation. His actions are consistently interpreted as disciplined extensions of established doctrine. However, subsequent observations begin to document a shift in operational behavior. These changes are not abrupt. They appear gradually across multiple engagements, often emerging in response to increasingly complex threats. Inquisition observers note that Eisenhorn demonstrates a growing willingness to approach, rather than avoid, sources of corruption when such engagement is deemed necessary to achieve a strategic objective. This approach is repeatedly described as controlled, with explicit effort made to limit exposure and maintain authority over the elements being engaged. Despite these precautions, the pattern itself is flagged as significant. A recurring observation across Inquisition reports is Eisenhorn's tendency to operate at the boundary between investigation and utilization. In earlier operations, his methodology is characterized by identification and elimination. In later records, there are instances where identification is followed by controlled interaction, with the objective of extracting information or leveraging specific properties of the target. This shift introduces ambiguity into his classification. He's no longer acting solely as a purifier of corruption, but as an agent who occasionally incorporates elements of that corruption into his operational framework. Conspiracy findings associated with Eisenhorn's activities further complicate his profile. Several sealed reports reference the possibility that his investigations have intersected with networks extending beyond individual heretical cells. These networks are described as distributed systems of influence, capable of operating across multiple sectors and embedding themselves within both civilian and official structures. Eisenhorn's repeated encounters with such networks suggest that his work has exposed layers of coordination not fully understood by the Inquisition at large. Some inquisitorial analysts propose that Eisenhorn's effectiveness in dismantling these networks may have inadvertently revealed deeper structures that remain active. It is speculated that his actions have drawn attention from entities or groups that operate at a higher level of organization, resulting in increased resistance and more complex countermeasures in subsequent operations. This interpretation positions Eisenhorn not only as an investigator, but as a focal point within a broader conflict that extends beyond isolated cases. Additional findings concern his interactions with other members of the Inquisition. Records indicate both cooperation and conflict, with Eisenhorn engaging in joint operations when objectives align, and opposing fellow Inquisitors when ideological differences become operationally significant. These conflicts are not presented as personal disputes. They are framed as manifestations of deeper divisions within the Inquisition itself, particularly between Puritan and radical philosophies. Eisenhorn's position within these divisions is described as transitional. He does not fully align with radical doctrine, yet his methods increasingly incorporate elements that Puritan frameworks reject. One of the most frequently cited points of concern is his association with practices considered highly controversial, including the controlled use of entities or artifacts typically classified as forbidden. Inquisition records do not uniformly condemn these actions. Instead, they document them with a combination of caution and analysis. Some reports argue that such methods represent necessary adaptation in the face of evolving threats. Others classify them as indicators of progressive deviation, suggesting that continued use may lead to loss of control or alignment with the very forces he seeks to oppose. Observations of his psychological profile provide additional context. Eisenhorn is consistently described as possessing a strong internal discipline, capable of maintaining focus and resisting external influence under conditions that would compromise less stable individuals. This discipline is cited as a mitigating factor in assessments of his more controversial methods. However, it is also noted that reliance on personal control introduces a single point of failure. Should that control be compromised, the consequences would extend beyond the individual, potentially affecting all operations and assets connected to him. Another notable observation concerns his relationship with his retinue. Inquisition records acknowledge that Eisenhorn forms functional and at times close, working relationships with selected individuals. These relationships enhance operational effectiveness by providing specialized capabilities and trusted support. At the same time, they introduce variables related to loyalty, dependency, and vulnerability. The loss or compromise of key members of his retinue is identified as a potential risk factor, both in terms of operational capability and psychological impact. Conspiracy-oriented findings also reference the possibility that Eisenhorn's investigations have uncovered knowledge not fully disseminated within the Inquisition. Some reports suggest that he operates with access to information that is either restricted or not yet integrated into broader intelligence networks. This creates an asymmetry in awareness, where Eisenhorn may be acting on insights not available to his peers. While this enhances his effectiveness in specific operations, it complicates coordination and oversight, as decisions may appear unconventional or unsupported when viewed without full context. Further speculation within these records considers the long-term implications of his trajectory. It is proposed that Eisenhorn represents a case study in adaptive methodology under conditions of escalating threat complexity. His actions demonstrate how an Inquisitor might evolve when confronted with adversaries that cannot be effectively countered through standard doctrine alone. This interpretation frames his behavior as a response to systemic limitations rather than individual deviation. However, it also raises questions regarding the sustainability of such adaptation and its compatibility with the Inquisition's foundational principles. In conclusion, Inquisition impressions, observations, and conspiracy findings present Gregor Eisenhorn as a figure of increasing complexity. He's recognized as effective, disciplined, and capable of addressing threats that challenge conventional approaches. At the same time, his evolving methods introduce ambiguity into his classification, positioning him between established doctrinal categories. These records do not provide a definitive judgment. Instead, they document an ongoing evaluation of an Inquisitor whose actions continue to influence and be influenced by the broader dynamics of the Imperium. Inquisition interrogation logs, sealed testimonies, and restricted after-action reports provide a more granular view of Gregor Eisenhorn's engagements, particularly in environments where standard investigative methods prove insufficient. These records move beyond general assessment and focus on direct encounters, anomalies, and behavioural patterns observed under controlled and uncontrolled conditions. Unlike broader evaluations, these findings are often fragmented, as many of the events described occurred under circumstances where full documentation was either impossible or deliberately limited. Personal encounters documented by Inquisition agents frequently emphasize Eisenhorn's capacity to dominate investigative environments without reliance on overt authority. Subjects brought before him, whether suspected heretics, compromised officials, or witnesses to anomalous events, consistently exhibit elevated stress responses even prior to formal interrogation. Observers attribute this effect not solely to his status, but to a combination of psychological presence and controlled psychic influence. His approach to interrogation is described as layered, beginning with conventional questioning and gradually incorporating subtle compulsion, allowing him to guide responses without triggering immediate resistance. In several recorded instances, subjects have provided information that contradicts their prior statements without displaying awareness of the inconsistency. This suggests a level of precision in Eisenhorn's psychic application that allows for targeted extraction of information while maintaining the subject's perception of autonomy. While effective, this method raises concerns within Inquisition oversight bodies as it blurs the boundary between interrogation and direct manipulation. The reliability of such information, while generally high, is noted to require secondary verification to ensure that extracted data has not been unintentionally altered through the process itself. Anomalies associated with Eisenhorn's operations become more pronounced in these records. Reports detail encounters with environments where sensory perception is distorted, time sequences are irregular, or physical laws appear inconsistent. In such conditions, Eisenhorn demonstrates an ability to maintain functional awareness and continue investigative processes. This capability is attributed to a combination of psychic discipline and cognitive adaptability. However, repeated exposure to such anomalies is identified as a potential risk factor, as prolonged interaction with non-standard environments can produce cumulative effects that are not immediately observable. One category of anomaly frequently referenced involves entities or constructs that exhibit partial integration between physical and warp-based characteristics. These entities do not conform to standard classifications and often require unconventional methods for containment or neutralization. Eisenhorn's engagement with such entities is characterized by controlled proximity and selective interaction. Rather than immediate destruction, he often seeks to understand the operational parameters of the entity, identifying vulnerabilities or mechanisms that can be exploited. This approach increases the likelihood of successful resolution, but also extends the duration of exposure to potentially corrupting influences. Personal encounter reports also highlight his interactions with individuals possessing unique or rare attributes, including those resistant to psychic detection or influence. These individuals are often incorporated into his operational framework, serving as countermeasures against threats that rely on psychic or warp-based mechanisms. While this enhances his effectiveness, it also introduces additional layers of complexity into his operations. The management of such individuals requires careful coordination, as their capabilities are often accompanied by limitations or risks that must be accounted for in mission planning. Inquisition observations further document instances of direct confrontation between Eisenhorn and other Inquisitors. These encounters are typically the result of conflicting interpretations of doctrine or disagreements regarding acceptable methods. In such cases, Eisenhorn's conduct remains consistent with his broader operational profile. He engages with opposing viewpoints but ultimately prioritizes his own assessment of necessity. This has led to situations where cooperative efforts transition into adversarial interactions, with each party attempting to assert authority over the operational outcome. Conspiracy findings within these records suggest that Eisenhorn's repeated involvement in high-complexity cases has positioned him within a network of overlapping investigations that extend beyond individual sectors. Some reports indicate that he has encountered recurring elements across multiple operations, including specific symbols, technological signatures, or behavioural patterns that imply coordinated activity. While no single report confirms the existence of a unified structure behind these elements, the frequency of their appearance has led to speculation regarding a broader system of influence operating beneath the surface of Imperial awareness. Additional speculation centres on the possibility that Eisenhorn's methods have evolved in response to these recurring elements. It is proposed that his willingness to engage with restricted knowledge and unconventional tools may be a direct result of encountering threats that cannot be effectively countered through standard doctrine. This interpretation frames his actions as reactive rather than proactive, suggesting that deviation from orthodoxy is a consequence of necessity rather than intent. Another area of concern identified in these records is the potential for cumulative psychological impact. While Eisenhorn consistently demonstrates high levels of control and resilience, the nature of his engagements exposes him to continuous stress, moral ambiguity, and exposure to corrupting influences. Inquisition analysts note that such conditions, when sustained over extended periods, can alter decision-making processes in subtle ways. These changes may not be immediately apparent but can influence long-term behaviour and strategic choices. Despite these concerns, there is no definitive evidence within the records to indicate loss of control or alignment with hostile forces. Eisenhorn's actions continue to align with his stated objective of protecting the Imperium, and his results remain consistent with this goal. However, the margin within which he operates is observed to be narrowing. Each successive engagement appears to require a greater degree of deviation from standard methods, increasing the complexity of his operational profile. Personal encounters also reveal a pattern of increasing isolation. As his methods diverge and his knowledge expands, the number of individuals capable of fully understanding or supporting his work decreases. This isolation is not absolute, as he continues to maintain a functional retinue, but it introduces limitations in terms of oversight and collaboration. Inquisition records note that isolation can amplify both strengths and weaknesses, enhancing focus while reducing opportunities for external correction. Conspiracy-oriented findings further suggest that Eisenhorn's activities may be influencing the behaviour of his adversaries. Some reports indicate that opposing forces have adapted their methods in response to his investigative style, implementing countermeasures designed to obscure patterns or misdirect analysis. This dynamic interaction creates an evolving environment in which both investigator and adversary adjust continuously, increasing the complexity of each subsequent engagement. In conclusion, Inquisition records concerning personal engagements, anomalies, and interrogative findings present a detailed and nuanced view of Gregor Eisenhorn's operational behaviour. He is consistently effective in extracting information, navigating anomalous environments, and resolving complex threats. At the same time, his methods introduce variables that challenge traditional frameworks of evaluation and oversight. These findings do not resolve into a single classification. Instead, they contribute to an ongoing assessment of an Inquisitor operating at the limits of established doctrine, where effectiveness and deviation exist in close proximity. Redacted Inquisition files concerning Gregor Eisenhorn present a fragmented but highly concentrated body of information, composed of partial transcripts, restricted annotations, and segments of reports deliberately obscured or removed. These files do not follow standard archival structure. Instead, they are arranged according to clearance thresholds, with access progressively limited as the content approaches areas of increased doctrinal sensitivity. What remains visible suggests that Eisenhorn's activities have intersected with matters considered too volatile for full dissemination, even within the Inquisition itself. Initial sections of these classified records reference operations in which standard documentation protocols were suspended. In such cases, only outcome summaries are preserved, while procedural details are either redacted or replaced with generalized statements. These summaries consistently indicate successful neutralization of threats, categorized as high or extreme risk. However, the absence of detailed methodology prevents direct analysis of how these outcomes were achieved. This omission is not accidental. It reflects a deliberate effort to restrict access to processes that may involve exposure to restricted knowledge unconventional methods, or entities deemed unsuitable for broader awareness. Among the most frequently referenced elements within these files are engagements involving warp-bound entities and artifacts of unclear origin. In several instances, annotations indicate that Eisenhorn maintained controlled interaction with such elements beyond the point at which standard protocol would require immediate destruction. The justification for this deviation is not explicitly stated, but accompanying notes suggest that the information or capability derived from these interactions was considered operationally significant. These decisions are marked with conditional approvals, indicating that oversight bodies were aware of the actions but chose not to intervene at the time. Additional redacted entries refer to internal disputes within the Inquisition regarding Eisenhorn's classification. Some segments suggest that formal review processes were initiated to evaluate whether his methods remained within acceptable boundaries. The outcomes of these reviews are partially obscured, but surviving annotations indicate that no immediate sanctions were applied. Instead, Eisenhorn was permitted to continue operations under observation, with periodic reassessment of his activities. This approach reflects a recognition of his effectiveness, balanced against concerns regarding long-term doctrinal alignment. A recurring feature within these classified files is the presence of cross-referenced investigations. Eisenhorn's name appears in connection with multiple cases that, on the surface, appear unrelated. However, the structure of the references implies that these cases share underlying elements, whether in the form of recurring symbols, technological signatures, or behavioral patterns. The nature of these connections is not fully disclosed, but their repeated appearance suggests the existence of a broader framework within which these individual cases operate. Some entries include annotations indicating that Eisenhorn himself contributed to the classification of certain information. This suggests that he exercised discretion in determining what data should be restricted, either to prevent misuse or to maintain operational advantage. Such actions introduce an additional layer of complexity, as they position him not only as a subject of evaluation, but also as an active participant in the control of information flow. This dual role complicates efforts to assess his activities from an external perspective, as the available data may already reflect selective filtering. References to his use of unconventional tools and methods become more explicit within these files, though details remain limited. Certain annotations allude to the deployment of assets typically associated with radical practices, including entities or mechanisms that require sustained control to prevent escalation. These references are accompanied by cautionary notes, emphasizing the necessity of maintaining strict oversight and containment. At the same time, the continued presence of such annotations across multiple operations indicates that these methods were not isolated incidents, but part of an evolving operational framework. Psychological assessments included within the classified records maintain a consistent evaluation of Eisenhorn's mental resilience and self-discipline. He's described as maintaining a high degree of internal control, with no immediate indicators of instability or loss of objective alignment. However, supplementary notes highlight the cumulative nature of his exposure to high-risk elements. It is suggested that while no single engagement has resulted in observable degradation, the aggregate effect of repeated exposure remains uncertain. This uncertainty is reflected in the decision to continue observation rather than impose corrective measures. Another area of concern documented in these files is the potential for informational asymmetry. Eisenhorn's access to restricted knowledge, combined with his role in controlling the dissemination of that knowledge, creates a situation in which he may operate with insights unavailable to his peers. This asymmetry enhances his effectiveness in specific operations but complicates coordination and oversight. Inquisition analysts note that decisions made under such conditions may appear inconsistent or unsupported when viewed without full context, increasing the likelihood of internal conflict or misinterpretation. Redacted segments also reference encounters with entities or conditions that challenge existing classification systems. These include phenomena that do not align with established categories of Xenos, heretic, or demon. The lack of clear classification complicates response protocols, requiring adaptive strategies that may fall outside doctrinal guidelines. Eisenhorn's involvement in such encounters is consistently associated with successful containment or resolution, but the methods employed remain largely concealed within the redacted sections. Concluding sections of the classified files do not provide a definitive resolution regarding Eisenhorn's status. Instead, they present a series of ongoing evaluations, each acknowledging both his effectiveness and the complexities introduced by his methods. He is neither formally censured nor fully endorsed as a model for replication. Rather, he is treated as a unique case, requiring continuous monitoring and contextual analysis. From the Inquisition perspective, Gregor Eisenhorn represents a convergence of capability and ambiguity. His actions consistently achieve results aligned with the protection of the Imperium, yet the means by which those results are obtained challenge the boundaries of established doctrine. The redacted nature of many records ensures that full understanding of his methods remains limited, even within the highest levels of authority. In conclusion, the classified files do not resolve the question of whether Eisenhorn's trajectory represents necessary adaptation or progressive deviation. They instead preserve the conditions under which that question must continue to be examined. His profile remains active, his methods remain effective, and his position within the Inquisition remains under sustained review.